Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we winter sow Foxglove Beardtongue. So let's go. I apologize about the scratchy throat. I'm just fighting a little bit of a cold, but I did want to mention that if you are very familiar with the winter sowing process, you've had a lot of success with it, then go ahead and skip to the timestamp shown below. However, if you're new to my channel or if you haven't watched a lot of winter sowing videos and you're still trying to learn, please watch this whole video because there's a lot of great information to learn about the basics of winter sowing, as well as learning more about the Foxglove Beardtongue plant and then how to winter sow it. Winter sowing is the process of sowing seeds outdoors during the winter months. You can simply scatter the seeds out on the ground, or you can sow the seeds in some sort of a container or pot. When it comes to what kind of container or pot to use, there are so many different choices out there. The big thing is you want to make sure it's translucent or clear. I like to use milk jugs, but I know other people have used juice jugs, rotisserie chicken containers, totes. The possibilities are endless. The big thing is no matter what container you choose, you want to make sure that it can hold at least 4 inches of soil in it. Your containers should have holes in the top to allow water or moisture to come in. The containers should also have holes in the bottom to allow for proper drainage of water. I like to use potting mix. You can use whatever works for you. The key is to make sure that it's well draining and also that it retains some moisture. You don't want to use a seed starting mix because it's too light, too fluffy, and it will dry out way too quickly. You also don't want to use garden soil because it's very heavy and it's too compacted, which makes it difficult for roots to grow in. There are a ton of benefits when it comes to winter sowing. It's very easy to do. It's cheap. It doesn't require any additional equipment. You don't need any grow lights. You don't need any room inside your house. Another benefit to the winter sowing process is that the seeds will get a natural cold stratification period. That's very important for certain seeds such as perennial seeds. And in the end, your seedlings will be stronger, they'll be healthier, and they'll already be hardened off. You don't need to do the whole hardening off process like you would have to do if you started your plants indoors. Now there is a certain timeline that you want to follow when it comes to winter sowing. If you start your seeds too early, there is a chance that those seeds will germinate prematurely, and if you get a cold snap, some of those plants that germinate quickly can die. However, if you start your seeds too late, what will happen is certain seeds, like the ones I talked about earlier that need a certain period of cold stratification time, they might not get that full period of cold stratification that those seeds need. So timing is everything. Now, of course, when it comes to the timing, it's going to vary from location to location. A general guideline is you do your winter sowing sometime starting in the month of December, but you want to be done with it sometime about 2 to 3 weeks before your average last frost date. But I want to give you a more specific timeline that I'm going to be following and that you can follow as well. So about 5 to 6 months before your average last frost date, you want to be sowing seeds that are requiring a cold stratification period. And those are usually perennials that are hardy in your area where you live. About 3 to 4 months before your average last frost date, that's a great time to be starting cold hardy plants. Plants that can tolerate cold, but also plants that reseed very easily in your area. Approximately 1 to 2 months before your average last frost date is a good time to start plants that are not cold hardy, plants that do better in warmer temperatures. Now, keep in mind though that when those seeds germinate, if you are going to have a cold snap, if you're going to have some cold nights, cold days, you want to protect those seedlings. You may need to cover them during that time. You may need to bring in your containers just for a few nights during those cold snaps. Don't be discouraged if you're running out of containers for winter sowing. Even though there are a lot of containers you can use, I prefer to use milk jugs. In fact, one year when I didn't have that many milk jugs, I contacted a local Starbucks. I asked them if they could hold some milk jugs for me. Well, they go through so many milk jugs a day, they were more than happy to hold a few bags for me. So definitely reach out to local coffee shops if you're looking for some sort of containers that are translucent or clear. Some people like to pre-moisten their potting mix, and that is totally fine to do. The reason you won't see me doing it in my winter sowing videos is because it is frozen outside during the months of January and February. So I'm just giving a small amount of water, but then I'm placing the milk jugs outside where they're going to be frozen for a long time. And as soon as the weather warms up, I'll start watering the milk jugs more often. In order to keep your milk jugs from flying around, you can always corral them together and then put some sort of a barrier around them just to keep them together. There are a lot of different options out there. You can use some sort of temporary fencing, you can use some sort of bricks or stones. You can be creative, but just be sure that your milk jugs are not toppling over and blowing around in the wind. We're going to start with a quick plant profile, and then we'll go ahead and winter sow our seeds. Foxglove Beardtongue is also known as Penstemon digitalis. What I love about this plant is that it looks good in so many different garden styles. In other words, you can have it in a formal garden, you can have it in a pollinator garden, native garden, or even out in a prairie or meadow type setting. The flowers on Foxglove Beardtongue are white, although there are some tinges of pink or purple. It has tubular flowers that have a dark green foliage, and that foliage can be semi-evergreen in areas in the south. Here's a fun fact for you. Penstemons are also known as beard tongues, and that's because the sterile stamen has a tuft of small hairs on it. Foxglove Beardtongue is hardy in USDA zone 3 through 8. In the world of perennials, there are some perennials that will last a long time. There are also some perennials that are called short-lived. This is one of them. So for that reason, it is so important to keep dividing this plant as well as starting it from seed, especially if you don't want the plant to die out in your garden. Foxglove Beardtongue is native to eastern North America and some parts of Canada. What I will do is put a list of all the areas where this plant is considered to be native. You know, there are some perennials that don't bloom for a very long time, and they can be a little disappointing. Well, this is not one of them. This plant will bloom for about 4 weeks, starting in the late spring months all the way through the early summer months. Penstemon digitalis prefers full sun to part shade and grows anywhere between 3 to 4 feet in height. Even though it's a moderately drought-tolerant plant, it does prefer consistently moist soil conditions. It makes for a great cut flower. The flower lasts anywhere between 4 to 7 days. However, you can extend the vase life by using some sort of a floral preservative, as well as storing the plants somewhere in a cool area. What I like about this particular plant, as well as other penstemons, is the seed pod. It actually looks very interesting. Even in the fall and winter months, it adds a lot of interest in the garden. The tubular flowers on this plant attract many hummingbirds as well as a variety of different bees. And I recommend not deadheading the plant after it's gone to seed, because the songbirds love to feast on the seeds of this plant. It's very important to differentiate this plant from the common foxglove, also known as digitalis purpurea. Common foxglove is native in Europe. It's not native in the United States. And even though the common foxglove is toxic to humans as well as animals, Foxglove Beardtongue is not harmful to humans or animals, which is really nice. The plant is known to be a deer and rabbit resistant, especially more mature plants. However, early in the spring when the plants are first emerging, or if you have some younger plants, deer may browse on them. Some common pests that you may find on your plants include snails, slugs, or nematodes. One issue you may encounter with this plant is fungal disease. So you want to make sure you're giving plenty of air circulation around the plant in order to avoid that. Also, it's a good idea to avoid overhead watering of this plant. The seeds need light to germinate, so when you sow the seeds, you want to press them into the soil or seed starting mix. If you are going to cover them, barely cover them with 1/8 of an inch of seed starting mix, potting mix, or vermiculite. You want to make sure you're giving the seeds a period of cold, moist stratification. We're going to be achieving that by winter sowing the seeds. However, if you're planning to sow the seeds and grow the plants indoors, you're going to have to give the seeds that cold stratification period. And you can do that by placing the seeds in your refrigerator anywhere from 30 to 60 days. If you're planning to start the seeds indoors under your grow lights, you want to sow your seeds about 6 to 10 weeks before your average last frost date. And if you don't know what your average last frost date is, I'll put a link down below. And go to that website, put in your zip code. It will tell you what your average last frost date is. There's also a map on there, and double check that map because the map is actually very accurate at telling you what your average last frost date is. The seeds will germinate when the conditions are right, somewhere between 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're sowing your seeds indoors and you're in a very cold room that doesn't get to that temperature range, you can use a heat mat, and that will help with getting your seeds to the proper temperature for germination. Just like a lot of other perennials, when you start them from seed, you may not see blooms from those plants the very first year that you sow the seeds. Definitely expect to start seeing blooms after the second year. Okay, let's go ahead and winter sow our Foxglove Beardtongue seeds. We'll be winter sowing these seeds right here together. However, I just wanted to show you all 3 Penstemon seeds that I'm planning to winter sow this year. These are the seeds that are native to my area that my friend Pam sent me. She has a backyard plant nursery, and so I'm going to be growing these plants on for her, but also for myself as well. So we both have plenty of plants for our own gardens as well as our plant nurseries. These are just some seeds that I collected from a Penstemon that I have in my own landscape. Rock Candy Pink is a type of Penstemon. I bought this plant last year on clearance at Walmart, and then the plant went to seed. So I collected the seeds, so it'll be fun to see if I can create more of those plants. There are so many different containers you can use for winter sowing, but regardless, no matter what container you're using, always make sure it's a clean container. And you want to be sure no matter what container you're using, it can hold about 4 inches of potting soil. You can see that that goes right around here. So when I make my cut, I want to make sure I'm cutting around here, but I also need this part here. I don't want to cut into it because this will be the handle to open and close my mini greenhouse. I'm going to need something sharp to cut my mini greenhouse or my milk jug. So I'm going to be using these. You can use scissors or anything else that you have. These are just cutting shears or snips that you would use to cut tin. I threw away the cap because I want to leave this part open. Whatever container you use, you want to make sure that you have some sort of holes in the top of it to allow for water like rain or snow to come in here, and that will help keep everything nice and moist inside of your mini greenhouse. And if for whatever reason you're not getting any moisture and things are drying out, you can always add water into this hole as well. I do like to add additional holes in the top here, but that's completely optional. I've been doing it for years and that's worked for me. You also want to add drainage holes in the bottom of your container. That will allow water to come out if there's too much water in here. And it also allows it so if you want to bottom water your container, you can easily do that because then the water can wick up and it can water the soil and the seedlings that are in here. I always like to add more than less holes in the bottom because I want to make sure that this container has good drainage. And that's all I'm going to add for holes. It's a small container. If this was a much larger container, then maybe I'd add some additional holes in the center here. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut my container. Some people like to use a marker and make a line. I'm not going to worry about that. It doesn't need to be a perfect line. I'm just going to start somewhere around here and I'm going to make my way onto the other side. Now I'm going to stop because I don't want to cut all the way through. I want to have an area here and here. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that I'm using the handle as a hinge for my mini greenhouse. And notice they don't perfectly line up, and that is totally okay. Next I'm going to go ahead and get some potting mix filled into the bottom of this container. I like to use potting mix, not seed starting mix. I find that it's better for holding the water and also it doesn't dry out as quickly. And I'm actually using potting mix that I made myself, and I'll put a link down in the description below on how to make your own potting mix. It saves a lot of money in the long run. The next thing is to push down lightly, not very hard. I'm trying to eliminate any sort of air pockets that might be in here. But I also don't want to press down too hard because as the plants start growing and their roots are forming, you want to make sure that the roots can grow inside of this potting mix. You'll notice that there are some seeds in there mixed in with non-seed material. That's totally okay. You can absolutely sow both of them together and just the seeds will germinate. It's really up to you how many seeds you want to sow in each of your containers. I like to heavily sow my seeds because then what I plan on doing is pricking out the seedlings once they have their first set of true leaves. I especially like to do that method when the seeds are tiny like these seeds are. And since I'm going to be growing these plants, not only for myself, but for my friend Pam, I'm also planning on starting some of these seeds indoors under my grow lights, just as an insurance. And that means I'm going to have to cold stratify the seeds in my fridge for a period of time. Since the seeds need light to germinate, I'm just pressing down on them. I don't want to cover them. And that ensures that the seeds are making good contact with the soil. I'm just using a garden marker because they don't wear off as easily as Sharpies do, and I like to add labels on the inside of my container just in case the label on the outside gets worn off for some reason. I'm just using this small hand water pump sprayer. You can use whatever you want to water your potting mix as well as your seeds. And I'm giving it just a gentle spray. I don't want to give it a very heavy spray because I don't want to dislodge any of the seeds. And remember, you may need to moisten all of your potting mix. Where I live, as soon as I bring this outside, this is going to freeze and it's going to stay frozen for days. And there will be some snow and rain that may come inside of here. But the main thing is it will be frozen. So I won't really need to add any more additional water to this, probably for the next month and a half to 2 months. I'm just using a paper towel to wipe the sides because I find it's easier to stick the duct tape onto the container if it's dry. I'm just using duct tape to seal my container shut. I know some people like to punch holes in the top as well as the bottom of their container, and then they like to close it using some sort of a twisty tie or a pipe cleaner, and that seems to work well. So use whatever you want to close your container as long as you're able to easily open it on the days when it gets really hot outside, because you don't want to burn your seedlings. But then on the days that it's kind of cold and you need to protect them, you need to be able to close this. Since we're sowing perennial seeds, I'm not too worried about it getting too cold in here. And the reason is these are hardy perennials in my zone. So since I typically winter sow perennials first, December, January, and February, I only add a few pieces of the tape on my container. There's really no use in me adding tape all the way around the container because even if some cold comes in here, it's not going to kill off these perennial plants once they start germinating. They'll be fine. And they're not going to germinate anyway until the soil conditions are right, and it's usually much later into the spring season. Now, when I start winter sowing plants that are not hardy, say vegetables or annuals that are not hardy in my area, then I may need to add tape all the way around. But I'm not going to worry about it now for my perennials. I've never done this before. I've only added 2 pieces or 3 pieces of tape, and I've always had success. I'm pushing down. I want to make sure that the tape is sticking to my container. I'm going to use my garden marker again, and I'm just going to label what the plant is in here. I used to label it directly on the container itself, but I actually like to reuse my containers. They usually last 2 to 3 seasons. So instead, I now label it on my tape. Some people, instead of putting in the plant name on the tape, they like to number it. So they might put a number 1, and then number 1 on a piece of paper or a spreadsheet would be the plant name. So Rebecca. Number 2 might be lupin. Number 3, foxglove, and so on. I can usually reuse my containers for at least 2, if not 3 years, if I take good care of them. It's so important to add native plants into our gardens, and I have plenty of them, but my goal is to continue adding more and more of them to my garden as well as to my plant nursery. I'll be placing the container outdoors where they can get access to rain or snow inside of this hole. And I'm also going to make sure I place them in an area where they're not going to blow around in the wind. Be on the lookout for future videos. I'll be sure to show you what the plants look like as soon as they start sprouting in the milk jugs, and then what comes next in terms of watering them, fertilizing them, potting them up, and putting them out in my landscape. There is still time left to be winter sowing perennials from seed, so I have plenty more that I'll be doing during the next few weeks. I'd love to know if you've ever grown Foxglove Beardtongue or if you're growing it for the first time this year. I really love all sorts of penstemon. I think they're very interesting, and I'm excited to have this one in my landscape. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.